A reading from the Gospel according to Thomas. Jesus says, "A city built on a high hill and fortified cannot fall, nor can it be hidden." Jesus says, "What you hear in one ear, in the other ear proclaim from your rooftops. After all, no one lights a lamp and puts it under a basket, nor does one put it in a hidden place. Rather, one puts it on a lampstand so that all who come in and go out will see its light." Jesus says, if a blind person leads a blind person, both of them will fall into the hole. Jesus says, one can't enter a strong man's house and take it by force without tying his hands. Then you can loot his house. Jesus says, don't fret from morning to evening and from evening to morning about your food, what you're going to eat, or about your clothing, what you're going to wear. You're much better than the lilies, which don't card and never spin. As for you, when you have no garment, what are you going to put on? Who could add to your lifespan? That same one will give you a garment. The disciples said, when will you be revealed to us and when will we see you? Jesus said, when you strip without being ashamed and take off all of your clothes and put them under your feet and trample them like little children dance, then you will see the Son of the Living One, and then you will not be afraid. Jesus says, often you have desired to hear these sayings that I'm speaking to you, and you have no one else from whom to hear them. There will be days when you will seek me, and you will not find me. The Gospel of the Lord. I first got interested in the phenomenon of near-death experiences in 1986. I had just left Africa, and I started reading about this. I was fascinated by it. And over the years, I have read many, many, many books about near-death experiences. And some of them are kind of just candy floss, and some of them are really, really deep and interesting. And often it's the candy floss that gets promoted and becomes bestsellers. The really good stuff, very few people get to read it. So I would say that of all the books I've read on the near-death experience, the one that made the most impact on me was a book called Return from Tomorrow. And it was written by George Ritchie, who's a psychiatrist, an MD. And very briefly, the story is this. He was a young 19-year-old man in 1941, in December 1941, right after Pearl Harbor, when America started to go into World War II. And he was part of a huge big training facility in Texas. There were thousands of servicemen of all kinds, Air Force, Navy, Army people, in the huge, huge big base. And that year, there was an extraordinary flu epidemic, which killed thousands of people, including thousands, very many of these young men. And this man, George Ritchie, was pronounced dead. He was taken into the morgue, and he was covered with a sheet, and he was left to his own devices for 90 minutes. He was clinically dead. They thought he was clinically dead. And 90 minutes later, somebody saw that he was breathing under the sheet, and he was rescued. He went on to take part in World War II, and he came back. He went to college, went to med school, became a doctor, and became a psychiatrist. And he wrote this fascinating book, Return from Tomorrow. And there's one incident that I just want to pick out this morning. So he claims that for that 90-minute period, before he was uncovered and brought back, he was led by some kind of a spirit guide to a whole bunch of different dimensions of reality. And one of the dimensions he visited, one of the places he visited, he was taken by this spirit guide into a bar room, what looked like a bar room, next to the base where there was a whole bunch of servicemen drinking. And it was an old rustic place with sawdust on the floor. And there are hundreds of Air Force and Army and Navy guys just jostling around and drinking to intoxication. And he said, as I watched it, I could see that there appeared to be two different kinds of beings in this room. Firstly, there were kind of the alive servicemen, and all of them had an aura around them, but they were all drinking really to excess. And at one stage, there was a whole bunch of other beings, he said, who looked exactly like they were human, but there was no vitality, there was no aura whatsoever kind, they were like the walking dead. But they were mingling with this other group. And he said at one stage, there's this young serviceman with 2 pints of beer in his hand, and he's walking across the floor, and it's just sawdust, and he slips and falls down and cracks his head off the floor. And he said, as I was watching, all of a sudden I could see his aura just shrinking and disappearing down his body. And all of a sudden, one of the other beings dived in through the top of his head and took occupancy of the spacesuit. And he said, I got it. That there are the living dead, there are disincarnate entities who are still addicted to earth life. And particularly if they got a particular physiological addiction, whether it's to drugs or alcohol or whatever. But they can't act it out because they don't have physical bodies in which to indulge it anymore. So they hang around places where people are intoxicated or drugged out of existence, and they take up occupancy. So they're really hijacking somebody's body in order to have the physiological experience to indulge their addiction. So that's one of the many places he visited. I want to talk about that a little bit today, because this notion that there are, like the living dead, the zombies who are soulless entities walking in the middle of live people. This is one of the accusations which is leveled against Gnosticism by the Orthodox churches, Orthodox Christianity. So I want to address that issue and some related issues this morning. I'll make 5 points this morning. The first one, I'll talk about the journey from Genesis to Job to Thomas. Then secondly, I will talk about Orthodox Christianity ideas on Gnosticism. And then thirdly, what Gnosticism really was about. Then fourthly, the Gospel of Thomas. And then fifthly, a short exegesis. I'll explain that term to you. So the first one, from Genesis to Job to Thomas. As we were listening to Kaji read this morning, and as I did the Gospel of Thomas, there's a very interesting evolution and development. And so the first one is the story of creation. It's a foundation myth. How human beings came into being, how women developed, how men developed, how animals developed, how things were given their names. And so it really is talking about our understanding of God as a creator who made physical things, including human beings. And it's from the very, very beginning of the book of Genesis. Now, the book of Genesis was written down about the year 950 BC. Judaism did not have an orthography before this. The Phoenicians, when they invented the 22-letter alphabet, which they did about 1000 BC, immediately it was captured by the Hebrews and by the Greeks and by the Romans, and a totally simplified language. Before this, language was a very, very cumbersome affair, depending on cuneiform or depending on hieroglyphics of various kinds. Very, very cumbersome. When the Phoenicians invented the alphabet of 22 syllables, it really radically transformed language. And it's this stage that the book of Genesis gets written. So it's written about 3,000 years ago. But in fact, it's based on much, much more ancient mythology that the Hebrews borrowed from the Sumerians. The Sumerian is a civilization that predates Judaism by a few thousand years. And Sumeria is really modern-day Iraq. That's what we're talking about. Mesopotamia, or the region between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, is the seat of a very ancient civilization. And the oldest written story on planet Earth comes from that region. It's called the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it is in written form going back about 2,400 years before Jesus. So it's really ancient, over 4,000 years old. It's the most ancient written story on the planet. And so the Hebrews would borrow very significantly from this. And so the story of Adam and the snake in the garden, all these are borrowing very, very heavily from the Sumerian mythology. There's a huge influence there. But it's talking about the physical evolution or the physical creation. By the time you get to Job, the book of Job was written probably around 500 before Christ. At this stage, it is hugely influenced by another Middle Eastern society. So where the first one was influenced by Iraq or Mesopotamia or the Sumerian civilization, whatever word you want to give to it, the book of Job and all of the wisdom literature in the Hebrew scriptures is hugely influenced by Iran, by Zoroastrianism, by Persian civilization. When the last 2 tribes of Israel are deported in 598 BC and they spent 70 years in Babylonia, Babylon was finally overcome by the Persians. And the Persians introduced them to Zoroastrianism, which is deep mystical kind of thinking, really into Sophia and wisdom. And so much of the Hebrew wisdom literature is hugely influenced by this period in their history. And so the book of Job, where in the book of Genesis, God is kind of an artisan, a craftsman. Now, in the wisdom literature, God is a philosopher, a lover of wisdom. And so there's a huge shift in the Hebrew understanding of who God is. By the time you get to the Gospel of Thomas, there's an even further evolution. Now God is understood not as a craftsman who made physical stuff, or not a philosopher who thought great wise thoughts, but as the mystical essence at the core of every single one of us. And where Genesis is hugely influenced by the Sumerian civilization, and where Job is hugely influenced by the Zoroastrian Iranian civilization, Thomas will be influenced, I think, by the Indian civilization. Thomas, we know from other of the Gnostic writings, spent time in India. I think he was very heavily influenced by Vedanta. And you see that a lot in the gospel in his teaching. So we've gone from God who's just a craftsman who makes stuff, physical stuff, to a God who's a philosopher, who thinks deep, deep, wise thoughts, and from whose wisdom creation happens, down to the idea that God is at the core of every single one of us, and that we're all mystics at core when we wake up. So that's just a quick look at the evolution among these three readings. So my second point then is this. I'm going to look at how Orthodox Christianity has treated Gnosticism. Because the truth is, up to the 1940s, the only knowledge we had of Gnosticism was what Orthodox Christianity told us in invective, vitriolic, antithetical kinds of documents. It was like reading about yourself from the literature of your enemies. They're obviously not going to give a good portrait of you. We tend to build straw images and then demolish them. Straw images of our enemies and then demolish them. In logic, this is called, or in philosophy, this is called reductio ad absurdum, where you take somebody else's position and you reduce it to its most ridiculous extreme, and then you demolish that. In other words, you create straw men and you demolish straw men. That was what happened with Gnosticism. The only knowledge we had of Gnosticism was what early Christian writers said to us about it, and they were vitriolically opposed to it. Until 1945, when the Nag Hammadi library came into being, and then we got to see Gnosticism speak for itself. So initially, we have a very biased account of what Gnosticism was. And what was that biased account? To put it very, very simplistically, what we got from Orthodox Christianity was that Gnosticism was a really negative system with a two-tier model of reality. There was the material world and there was the spirit world. And the material world was evil and dark and sinful. And it was peopled by the zombies, like the story in George Ritchie's book. Soulless ghouls who walk around the planet. Most of the people on the physical plane are these ghoulless, soulless, walking dead. However, sprinkled among them are a few enlightened beings. But these enlightened beings have fallen asleep because they look like the rest of us. They're in the same kinds of spacesuits. They eat the same kind of food as the rest of us. And so they're souls, but they're sleeping. Where the rest of them are just zombies, these few are souls asleep. And at some stage, they hear a message, and they remember who they really are, and they wake up. And at the end of last week's homily, I gave you a story about this. It's called the Hymn of the Pearl, which comes from another Gnostic gospel. So very simplistically, the belief system in Orthodox Christianity was that Gnosticism was this very dualistic system. There's black and white, there's real people, and there's the zombies. There's sin and there's light, and we're trapped in these bodies, and the only way we can get out is kind of break out of the bonds of the body. That's what Orthodox Christianity would have us believe. Now, when you think about it, in fact, this is an extraordinary projection. Because I don't know what kind of Christianity you grew up in, but when you study medieval Christianity, or even if you were lucky enough to be raised a Roman Catholic in the 1940s and 1950s before Vatican II, I'm sure a lot of this sounds vaguely familiar to you. That we live in a vale of tears, that the body is sinful, and the only real sin is sexual sin, because any kind of carnal desire is wrong, and the soul is trapped in the body, and we have to do penance in order to release the body, and all kind of sexual activity is sinful. Only that which leads to breeding directly leads to a baby, only that is acceptable. And the ultimate kind of virtue is celibacy and chastity. Does any of that sound vaguely familiar? Does any of that sound like a projection? This was the Roman Catholicism of my youth. And this is what they're claiming Gnosticism consisted of. So it's a very biased report. It's the typical kind of projection where you look at the stuff you can't handle in your own culture or your own self, and you project it onto the enemy. So that's what Orthodox Christianity would have us believe about Gnosticism. It's my second point. Point number 3 then. What did Gnosticism really look like? So let me give you a little bit of background to it. In the year 333 BC, Alexander the Great, possibly the greatest military genius of all time, swept across the known world. Beginning in Macedonia, swept right across through the Middle East, all the way across in a 10-year campaign of conquest to the very gates of India. And in that conquest, he created a huge cultural and religious vacuum. All of the civilizations and all of the peoples who were dependent upon their particular God to save them from the enemies, they realized their gods were totally ineffective. People became atheists in droves. Cultures became atheistic in droves. Their gods on whom they had depended had been totally inadequate to the task of defending them. So there was this huge cultural vacuum and this huge religious vacuum created. And as you know, nature hates a vacuum. So rushing into this vacuum came a whole bunch of what are called mystery religions and different kinds of cults. They came rushing in to fill this vacuum. So at this stage now, there were very, very many different forms of mystery religions, which loosely we could call Gnosticism. Now, Gnosticism is a whole spectrum of religious thinking. It is ridiculous to talk about Gnosticism as a particular religion. It's not a particular religion. It's a whole spectrum of thinking. All the ways from the totally weird to the deeply mystical. And so to treat Gnosticism as a kind of a monolithic religion is ridiculous. It's like talking about, all religion is bad because you come across bad religious people. Or saying, we should demolish politics because politicians are corrupt. Of course there are corrupt politicians, and we can't survive without some kind of a political system. Of course there's corruption within the churches, among the people, and among the teaching, but that doesn't mean that we can just demolish all of religion and create this vacuum. But the effort was to treat Gnosticism as this monolithic system. It was anything but. It was an entire spectrum, all the ways from the totally weird, and there was weird stuff, across to the deeply mystical, and there was deeply mystical stuff. And when you examine the Gnostic gospel material that's come down to us, the vast bulk of it is at this end of the spectrum. It is deeply mystical stuff. There's some weird stuff there, but the vast bulk of it is deeply, deeply mystical stuff. And it is speaking at a really deep level. So the word Gnostic itself, or gnosis, it's a Greek word, Gnosis, the same word from which we get the English word knowledge, but it's a different kind of knowledge. It's not so much secret in the sense that it's hidden from us, but it's secret in the sense that you have to dig much deeper. Because where typical knowledge for us is the question of acquiring data, you look at a bunch of stuff and you see it and you acquire knowledge from that. This happens differently. This is not knowledge that we gain via our sensory modalities. It is not stuff that can be deduced. It's not stuff that can be inferred. It is not stuff that can be reasoned into our being. It comes through a totally different faculty. Carl Jung touched on it very briefly when he defined intuition. Jung defined intuition as follows. He said, intuition is perception via the unconscious, where our normal perception is that we take in information through 5 senses and then we work on it in this black box and then we have a perception of reality. That's how we typically define perception. Jung says intuition is different. Intuition is perception via the unconscious. So that's one modality. So there are many, many ways in which we acquire wisdom, which is not about knowledge, it's not about data, it's not about factoids, it's not about filling our heads with facts, it's none of that. There's a knowledge, there's a wisdom, there's a gnosis that comes through at a very different level. And so I've said to you many times that how I personally define truth, for me truth is not the correspondence between facts and models, or between facts and what I tell you. That's not truth, that's only mapping. Real truth for me is that which wakes me up and aligns me with source. For me, something is only true if it wakes me up and it aligns me with source. And something is only, ultimate truth for me is that which radically wakes me up and aligns me permanently with source. So for me, truth has nothing got to do with factoids. It's much more a Gnostic kind of a reality. Whatever aligns me with source and does so permanently, that is real truth. And so when you work your way through the Gnostic scriptures and you look what they're saying about themselves, this is what they mean by knowledge. They don't mean some kind of a hidden stuff that's only for the initiate. They mean looking into the depths of the reality of stuff. Because when we're faced with any bunch of data, including a story or a life experience, we will experience it at very different levels depending on where we're at in our journey. And so, for instance, we can experience stuff and interpret stuff just literally and fundamentalistically. Or we can go a little bit deeper and we can begin to interpret stuff metaphorically and symbolically. Or we can go yet deeper and we can begin to understand stuff in a deep, deep mystical way. So even symbolism and metaphor isn't true gnosis. So they're talking about digging deeper and deeper and deeper. And this would be something that Jesus would have to face many times in his own life. He would be constantly misunderstood. And so again and again he will say, even in the canonical scriptures, the person who has ears to hear, please listen. Because he realized that his audience was appreciating him at totally different levels. There were some people who were just listening literally to what he said. There were some people like the Romans who just saw a political threat. There were some people like the religious leaders who just saw a theological threat. There were some people like the mobs who just saw an entertainer. There were some people like his family initially who thought he was crazy and that he was embarrassing the family. There were some people like his disciples who initially just saw him as a meal ticket to fame. He was going to be the Mashiach, the king of Israel, and they were going to be his courtiers. And then there were people like Mary of Magdala who really saw him. And so there's a great story, for instance, in the Gospel of Thomas, where other disciples are really jealous of Mary, and they complain to Jesus. And they say, "Why is it that you kiss her on the lips?" And typical Jesus, he answers in a parable. He says, if two people are in a very, very dark room, one of them is sighted and the other is blind, but they're in a dark, dark room, neither of them can see. But if they come out into the light, the blind one still can't see, but the sighted one will see. That is why I kiss Mary on the lips. Now, what does that mean? It means that Mary got who Jesus was. It means that while the Romans saw him as a political threat, and the Pharisees saw him as a theological threat, and the mob saw him as an entertainer, and the disciples saw him as a meal ticket, and his family saw him as an embarrassment, Mary saw him for who he really was. So the kissing on the lips is not just about a physical embrace, it's about the fact that lips to lips, or mouth to mouth, or ear to ear, or heart to heart, they were in deep, deep communion. And she got him at a level that the others didn't get him. Now this is what Gnosticism really about. This is what mystical Gnosticism is about. It's about being able to touch the soul of Jesus. It's about able to kiss him on the lips, not into kind of in a homosexual encounter, but in the sense of drinking in from his soul, because his soul and your soul are the same soul. They are the soul of spirit. This is what the core of Gnostic material is about. That's my third point. So let me talk specifically about the Gospel of Thomas. And I spread myself on this topic last Sunday, so I'm not going to say a whole lot about it today. I will recap some of it very briefly and add a few pieces to it. So the Gospel of Thomas is one of the Gospels found at Nag Hammadi in December of 1947. But the extraordinary thing, when it was discovered, it was written in Coptic. Coptic is the Egyptian language written in Greek orthography, so it's a Greek alphabet, but it's Egyptian. So they're written in Coptic. When they translated them from Thomas's Gospel from Coptic into other languages, they discovered all of a sudden that some of the passages they'd already seen. Where had they seen them? They had seen them, there was material recovered in 1898 from a monk's grave in another place in Egypt called Oxyrhynchus. And there were fragments, 3 different fragments, that didn't make much sense to them. When they found Thomas's Gospel in Coptic and they translated it, they suddenly realized these 3 passages we found in 1898 were actually Greek originals of this part of Thomas's Gospel. So it tells us that Thomas's Gospel goes a lot further back. The Coptic version that we found in 1947 probably was written, actually physically written, about the year 340 AD. But it's a translation of stuff that was found at Oxyrhynchus, which dates from 200 AD. And very probably they're both translations from earlier texts, which some scholars would claim go back to 50 AD. If indeed they go back to 50 AD, it would make Thomas's Gospel 20 years older than the first of the canonical scriptures, which is Mark's Gospel, written in 70 AD. So possibly it is the oldest Christian scripture on the planet. Paul began writing in 51, so it would even have beaten Paul by a year. And who was the author to this? Fascinating. The introduction says, this was written by Didymus Judas Thomas. Now, Didymus is just the Greek word for a twin. And Thomas is the Hebrew word for a twin. Thomas was not a given name at the time of Jesus. It wasn't a given name, it was a nickname. And the reason that one of the disciples was given the nickname Thomas was because among Jesus' 12 disciples, there were two people called Judas. There was Judas the Iscariot who betrayed him, and then there was Judas, another Judas, and to distinguish them apart, they named the second Judas, they called him Thomas, which means the twin. So Thomas was not a real name, it was a nickname given to him. So he says, the person writing this gospel is Didymus Judas Thomas. Twin, and my real name is Judas. And now who is this Judas? Within the text he's identified as the twin, obviously. So of whom is he a twin? Was he just called the twin because his twin brother was not one of the 12, but they knew he was a twin, so they called him a twin? There's a theory that claims he was actually a twin within Jesus' family, that he was a twin brother of some other member of Jesus' family, maybe one of his sisters, or possibly James. But there's also thinking that he was Jesus' twin brother. And you can take this in one of two ways. And in various Gnostic Gospels, they interpret it differently. Some of them claim this was an actual biological blood connection, that Judas and Jesus were actually twins. Another one says that this is a spiritual connection, that they're twin souls in the sense that this Judas also really understood who Jesus was. So in a sense, it doesn't make that much difference, but there's that level of closeness to them. Either linear, bloodline closeness, or spiritual lineage closeness. So that's the author of this gospel. And what does the gospel look like? It's 114 sayings. It's a sayings gospel. There are no accounts of events in Jesus' life here. No stories about him. There's no birth narrative. There's nothing about his death. And there's nothing about his resurrection. In fact, there's no mention of resurrection in Thomas's gospel. Rather, it's a series of 114 sayings. And so if you were reading, it just simply says, Jesus says. Jesus says. Jesus says. And it's just 114 of Jesus says. And a lot of them you'll find in the canonical Gospels. If you were reading carefully, if you were listening carefully today, you have the story about a city set on a hilltop cannot be hidden. Or you don't take a lamp and put it under a basket, you put it on top of a lampstand. All of these we've heard before. Or the lilies of the field, we've heard all of these. So a lot of the sayings in Thomas are ones that we also find in the canonical Gospels. But if you are to believe the scholarship, Thomas's version came before these other versions. But much more fascinating to me, there's a whole bunch of stuff in Thomas's Gospels, sayings attributed to Jesus, which are not found in any of the other canonical biblical sources. And they're the ones I want to treat of for a few moments at the very, very end today. And so Thomas's Gospel is very, very unique. Thomas's Gospel is very, very different from the other Gospels. So I want to take just a few of the passages then of Thomas's Gospel, the different ones, very, very briefly, and have a look at them. So he says at the beginning of today's reading, he says, when you hear the good news, it goes in through one ear, I want you to proclaim it out through the other. Now that's kind of a strange statement, yeah? I mean, how can you proclaim out through your ear? We think, in one ear and out the other. That's not good. If we think of in one ear and out the other, it means you really haven't processed, remembered, or understood. But there's a very different sense in this. It has a sense of urgency and being uncensored. Because when you think about it, if you hear through this ear and you speak out there, you're having to do a 90-degree twist to the information. If you get it in here and you speak it out there, it's uncensored. You're actually just putting it right through in the form in which you got it. So for me, it speaks about not twisting. You got to twist stuff that comes in your ear. If you're going to speak it, you got to twist it at 90 degrees to itself. And if you study the scriptures so very often, that's what happens. We get stuff twisted at 90 degrees towards original intention. So my sense is that Jesus is saying, I want you to proclaim it with your ear. I want you to feed it right through. Now, if we're feeding it right through, this must mean that the accusation that this is secret stuff, it's not secret stuff. Thomas will use the word secret in a very, very different way. When Thomas talks about secret, he doesn't mean something that you whisper to somebody who's in the in-group and somebody else comes on and says, well, she goes by him. And then you start whispering again. That's not the way he's using the word secret. He's saying that when you speak a truth, your audience will deal with it very differently depending on where the audience is at any level of the dialogue. And so when you look even at how the Gospel of Thomas was found, this is very true. It has nothing got to do with elitism. It has got to do with the reality that we're all at different places. In every aspect. Athletically, we're in different places. Musically, we're in different places. Our ability to speak is in different places. Our ability to be spiritual, it's in different places because of different gifts we have. So when you look at, for instance, what happened to the find itself. It was found in December 1947. This material, a whole cache, a big jar, ceramic jar with over 1,000 pages of manuscript in it. 13 books, 11 complete, 2 incomplete. 52 different tractates and over 1,000 different pages. What happened? When these two men brought this stuff home to their house, their mother freaked out. And she burned a whole bunch of it. Because she thought, literally, it was a genie in a bottle. And you don't take the top off a bottle and let the genie out. What kind of bad luck is going to come to our house? And so her response to it, her only reaction to this material, was a superstitious reaction. That's one level of audience. What was the reaction of the sons? It was economic opportunity. This is good stuff, we could sell this, and they began to dole it out slowly. And finally, somebody got a hold of it all and began to feed it into the system. And they tried to sell the Gospel of Thomas, of one of the codices, the Codex of Jung. They tried to sell it in New York. They tried to sell it in Paris. And then finally, Carl Jung got his hands on it. And so, for the brothers, it was just a source of income. It's another level of audience. When the scholars got to see it, and they began to realize what it was, they were jumping for joy. But it was an intellectual curiosity and an intellectual excitement. But when the deeply spiritual people got their hands on it, when the mystics got their hand on it, when modern day Gnostics got their hand on it, it wasn't about genies in bottles, it wasn't about superstition, it wasn't about economic opportunity, it wasn't about intellectual excitement, it was that this stuff resonated at the core of their being. And so when you talk about secret gospels, it's not that this is for an elite group. This is the realization that everything will meet an audience at the place the audience is in. Every single one of us is in a different place with regard to any human attribute. And we will unpack it according to our ability. So this is what Thomas is saying this morning. So going in one ear and coming out the other ear it is not secret, obviously, if I meant to proclaim it immediately. In fact, I'm not meant to stop the process at all. As soon as it comes in, I'm not going to do anything with it by bending it or twisting it. I'm going to feed it right through. And Thomas says, from your housetops. I'm meant to shout this aloud. That's not censorship, and that's not secrecy in the sense in which we accuse them of being secret and elitist. We're shouting the stuff out. So that's the first little piece I want to comment on. Now, the word exegesis at the beginning. Exegesis is just a term used for teasing asunder or trying to understand sacred texts. So it's a fancy word. It just means trying to understand or tease asunder or interpret a sacred text. So the next piece I want to pick up on is this. This statement where, and Jesus has a kind of a Socratic style in the sayings Gospel of Thomas. Often he asks questions as a teaching tool. So he says, when you have nothing to wear, who's going to give you a garment? And you can see a lot of dumb looks from his disciples. Well, I don't know. So he says, okay, I'll make it easier for you. Who can add time to your span of life? And we know that one, God. Okay. The same one that adds time to your span of life is the same one that will give you the garment. Now, what does this mean? Does this mean that God our Father in heaven is going to give us clothes so we don't have to be worried? We're like the lilies of the field. So God is going to give us clothes to wear and he's going to give us food to eat. Doesn't mean that. That's only parenthetical to what it means. It doesn't mean that at all. It means that God is going to give us, don't laugh, Ed, spacesuits. It means when we have no clothes to wear. It means when we are pure spirit and we haven't incarnated, who is going to give us a garment? God is going to give us a garment. Because when we volunteer for an earth mission, God is going to give us the resources we need for an earth mission. And this is precisely what I meant when I wrote that part of the Eucharistic prayer. What I wrote down, I said, this is my body. The body that I accepted at my incarnation. The body that I needed for my mission. The body which is the Word made flesh. And you also did the same thing. That's exactly what I meant by that. This straight out of Thomas. I didn't know it at the time, but it was straight out of Thomas. And so when you have nothing to wear, who's going to give you a garment? God is going to give you a garment. God will give you the body you need for your incarnational mission with all the resources. And that will mean food as well and clothes as well, but that's kind of parenthetical. But the real body, the real clothes you're going to get, God will give it to you. And God has given it to you. Every single one of us sitting here today has been given the garment we needed for the mission we've chosen to undertake on planet Earth. So I'll pick up on that a little bit later in the same text. They said to him, when are you going to reveal yourself to us? When will we see you? And Christ says, when you strip off completely, like little children, and you put your clothes on the ground and you dance on them, then you will see the Son of the Living One. So what's he talking about there? Does he mean that we're all to become Janes and walk around in the nip? He's not talking about that. Does he even mean that it's about overcoming ego? And so that I have no embarrassment about my nakedness, so because my ego is out of the question, like Adam in the first reading today. They were naked, it said, but they weren't embarrassed because they still hadn't sinned. Does it mean that? No, it doesn't mean that. Does it mean that we will take off our clothes and trample on them, that when we die, we will no longer have bodies because we're resurrected? No, it doesn't mean that either. So what does it mean? When we, like little children, we take it off and we trample on it, then you will see the Son of the Living One. But you won't be seeing him outside, you'll be seeing him inside. So what does it mean? It means that when you come to the realization and your eyes open and you see who you really are, and you stop identifying with the clothes, and you stop identifying with the spacesuit, then you will see the Son of the Living One. Then you will see the daughter of the Living One, because you are the daughter of the Living One, and you are the Son of the Living One. So it is not about disrespecting our bodies. Once you have disidentified with your body and identified with the soul, then you realize that the body is a gift. You needed it to have an incarnational experience. You needed it in order to carry out your mission. It needs to be fed and housed and clothed and protected. It needs all of these things, but only as a consequence of mission, not because I'm identified with it. And there's the great Vedantic influence again, the great Hindu saying, I have a body, but I'm not my body. I have emotions, but I'm not my emotions. I have an intellect, but I'm not my intellect. I have a personality, and I'm not even my personality. And so the deep, deep mystical understanding of Thomas is that every single one of us, naked as we were, and there was nothing wrong with our nakedness, just as in the first story, Adam and Eve had no problem with their nakedness, because at that stage they're pure soul. Their nakedness as embarrassment only came when they started identifying with their spacesuits rather than realizing that they were children of God. The invitation for us is, the next time you watch your little 2-year-old grandniece strip off in the middle of a party and dance in her clothes, and you try to terribly hush her out of the room or cover her up, think for a moment about what she's really doing. Because she gets it. She still hasn't been programmed out of that place. She's dancing on the spacesuit because she's still not identified with the spacesuit. She knows she's the living child of God.